obvious what we're seeing in Sri Lanka. It's a cover-up. It's an attempt to deny that these things took place.
There has to be a proper investigation, and if crimes have been committed, the perpetrators have to be brought to justice.
I called my family and I told my mum, this could be the last time you speak to me.
I think it's difficult to calculate how great the consequences may be if we, the world, continue in this absolute failure to address the truth and the horror of what has happened in Sri Lanka.
Tells the story of the last 138 days of the Sri Lankan Civil War. So it covers the period of the final onslaught. And in that period, the government of Sri Lanka announced what they called no-fire zones and herded literally hundreds of thousands of people into these no-fire zones and then systematically shelled and bombed them. They also denied them food and medicine as well, itself a crime under international law. And estimates of how many people died, we still don't know, extraordinarily, but estimates range from 40,000, up as many as 40,000, which one UN report suggested could have died, to a more recent UN report which suggests the figure could be as many as 70,000 or even more. It has to be said, though, that the Sri Lankan government, of course, deny that anything like this happened. They deny that anyone died as a result of government shelling. But I'm afraid all the evidence is absolutely clear. The evidence that we've collected, the evidence the UN has collected, the evidence that organisations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch and the International Crisis Group have collected. I'm afraid these massacres did happen, and this is, I'm afraid, a true story. I mean, one of the things that happens when we show this film to governments and to diplomats is actually that they are so shocked and that they change their mind, because the Sri Lankan government has very cleverly given a very false impression to the world. You have to understand what happened at the start of the war, when at the start of the final offensive. What the Sri Lankan government did was they dressed up their offensive against the Tigers entirely in the language of the West's war on terror. They said this was part of the West's war on terror, and they used that as they pursued this as effectively part of the West's global war on terror. Then, of course, immediately after the Tigers were defeated, and along with the Tigers, so many thousands of civilians were massacred, they then changed their tune slightly and then addressed the non-aligned countries, the African countries, South American countries, Asian countries, and said, you know, now we must be allowed to do our own, find our own way of reconciliation, find our own way of peace. And they warned the rest of the world to back off and to stop asking questions. Now, this was a very cynical exercise, because before they'd been very happy to use the language of the West, but now in 2010 the Sri Lankan President Mahinda Rajapaksa went to the United Nations and made a speech in which he said, everyone must now back off. We need to find a Sri Lankan solution to this. We are a small independent nation and we need to find our own solution. We don't need foreign powers interfering, and we don't need the West telling us what to do. Now, this was, on the face of it, seemed reasonable. So it is a piece of hypocritical nonsense for the Sri Lankan government to pretend now that they are objecting to Western interference when they were more than happy to use the West's rhetoric to justify what they were doing in the first place. And I think the thing is that when we take this film around and we show this to some of the delegations, for example, and there was one African delegation at the United Nations Human Rights Council who, when they saw this, they said to me afterwards, the Sri Lankans pulled the wool over our eyes. So there was a clear understanding when presented with the evidence that the Sri Lankan government cannot be trusted to investigate themselves, and that the Sri Lankan government are engaged in a very hypocritical exercise when they pretend that this is about Western interference. It's not about Western interference, it's about human rights and the basic rule of law. The The first two films were television documentaries, so much shorter and designed for a British audience primarily. So this film is designed to be, it's a feature-length film, it's an hour and a half long. We like to think of it as the definitive film of record, but also as a call to action. And it's designed for taking around international audiences. It's designed for showing to the public and to diplomats and politicians around the world what really happened. It has more context as well, more historical background. It tries to explain how this situation arose, the legacy of colonialism, which in effect created the problems in Sri Lanka, and how it also shows, I think very importantly, it looks at what's happening now, so that it examines the situation in Sri Lanka just now, where the government is increasingly repressive, because many people hoped that at the end of the war, the hand of reconciliation, despite the war crimes, that the hand of reconciliation would be handed out to the Tamil people. In fact, the very reverse has happened. The government is clamping down even more. Where there was once a war against the Tamil Tigers, now there is, if you like, a silent war against the Tamil people, the Tamil civilians. They are not allowed to meet in more than four or five people in the northeast, in the Tamil homelands. The Tamil homelands are being ethnically re-engineered. They're still, while thousands of Tamils are homeless, the government are building barracks. The government have moved vast numbers of troops into the northeast. Those trips are almost entirely Sinhala, and indeed they're paying them a bonus to have a third child as part of this process of ethnic re-engineering. Street names are being changed from Tamil into Sinhala. Sinhala families, fishermen and farmers, perfectly decent people, I'm sure, but they're being used by the regime to change the demographic balance in the north, to try and destroy forever the calls for an independent Tamil Eelam. And it represents, I suppose, the culmination of 3 years' work. It has some elements from the previous documentaries, but also a lot of new evidence. And it's designed for an international audience. It's an hour and a half long. Now, this film, I suppose, has two key sets of evidence. The first is the evidence, which is the footage showing the massacres of the civilians in the no-fire zone. And the consequences of this terrible, terrible war in which the government quite clearly and quite deliberately targeted civilians. But in addition to that, it has a second set of evidence, if you like, which is the evidence of a series of war crimes committed at the end of the war. And this footage was actually filmed by government soldiers themselves, trophy footage, in which it shows them executing bound naked prisoners, shocking breaches of international law and war crimes. It shows the aftermath, very distressing aftermath, of sexual assaults on some of the women fighters. What they were systematically doing, and you can tell this from the images, from the pictures, and also from what people are saying, is that they were taking Tamil Tiger female fighters and they were stripping them, sexually assaulting them, blindfolding them and tying their hands behind their backs, and then executing them, shooting them in cold blood. And we see the aftermath of this. It's some of the most distressing footage I've ever seen. Also other incidents, including, for example, the aftermath of the execution of the 12-year-old son of the Tamil Tiger leader, Villipilla Prabhakaran. His son, Balichandran, we now have collected from a variety of sources evidence of him dead, photographs and moving images of his dead body, but also now, very disturbingly, still photographs which were taken, we can tell from the metadata, 2 hours before the ones showing him dead. And these appear to show him in a bunker, in captivity, guarded by a government soldier, and perfectly safe and calm, even eating a snack which he'd been given. And then 2 hours later, he was executed in cold blood. So this is very, very compelling evidence. And the evidence, in a sense, what's most disturbing about this evidence is that it shows that it's such a pattern. There is a pattern. The same thing is happening to prisoners right across the board. It shows a pattern of sexual violence, a pattern of execution of unarmed, bound, naked prisoners. And that kind of pattern of behaviour, as a prominent international, well-respected international human rights lawyer points out in the film, that pattern suggests that it's systematic. And if it is systematic, that suggests, at the very least, it is endorsed but in fact all the evidence suggests was encouraged and sanctioned from above. And in an organisation like the Sri Lankan army, which is a very disciplined structure, whose hierarchy command goes right up to the very top levels of government, that there is a huge culpability on the behalf of all these leaders for these crimes. It can't be dismissed as the actions of a few maverick soldiers. This is something that the government has to take responsibility for. And that's why it's so important that the international community now investigates this, because this crime, the Sri Lankan government have demonstrated after 4 years that they are neither willing nor capable of investigating these crimes themselves, mainly because the Sri Lankan government are indeed the prime suspects. Moreover, of course, they've now attempted to destroy, and indeed partially succeeded in destroying, the independent judiciary. So there is no longer the mechanism whereby this country, under the present regime, could investigate itself. That is why it's so essential that the international community, in the interests of humanitarian law and in the interests of human rights, launches an independent investigation. And I hope that throughout the world, and I know that actually increasingly throughout the world, countries are saying, well, this is a special case. This is something where we do have to take a stand. This is something where we cannot let this maverick government get away with it. And I hope very much that countries like Malaysia will seriously consider whether they can, in all honesty, abstain or vote against this kind of inquiry, because by doing so they are it's not a neutral position to abstain, it's an endorsement of the status quo, and the status quo is that regime is in charge and that regime is guilty of war crimes. I hope very much that governments of goodwill throughout the world will consider voting for a resolution, and a resolution at the United Nations which calls on the international community to mount an international inquiry.